Welcome to Before the Day Ends. So we're in Matthew 26, and we've already talked a bit about Judas and his betrayal and the difference between Lord and Rabbi in that story. So here we are in 26. Jesus is celebrating Passover with his disciples, and we come to the section about the Lord's Supper, which again is in the midst of this section of betrayal by Judas. And I want to say a couple things about this today. So Matthew 26, verse 26. While they're eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take and eat, this is my body." Then he took a cup. After giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will never again drink of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. So a couple things I want to say here. So yes, this ties to the Passover Seder. What we believe is that Jesus uses one of the cups in the Seder, not the last cup, but he kind of cuts the Seder kind of in the middle, let's say, towards the end. But he cuts the Seder short and says, "I'm not going to finish this Passover Seder until I return with you." So this is kind of what's going on here. This, "I will not drink again the fruit of the vine until I drink with you in the kingdom," is saying that the Seder that he starts here at the institution of the Lord's Supper is not complete until he returns. So this Seder, if you will, this Passover is still open. The connection of the Passover is important, where God rescues his people from Egypt. And remember, that's also a Moses story, which we had early in our discussion of Matthew. How much of this is tied to Moses? So as the people put the blood over the doorpost in ancient Egypt to be set free, to be passed over by the angel of death from God. So here, Jesus is giving himself as a Passover. He puts his blood to cover us so that we can be set free. We can be protected from death by his sacrifice. Therefore, he is the Passover lamb, as we saw in the story in Exodus. So also, it says that they sung a hymn. They went to the Mount of Olives. In the Passover Seder, traditionally, one of the hymns that was sung was Psalm 118. If you go back to the book of Psalms, in Psalm 118, there's a sense of irony in this psalm, as if you can imagine these folks now leaving the Passover Seder. It's not really complete. They head to the Mount of Olives, and then we have, "The Lord is on my side to help me. I shall look in triumph on those who hate me." And again, in verse 19, "Open to me the gates of righteousness, that I may enter through them and give thanks to the Lord." Verse 21, "I thank you that you have answered me and have become my salvation. The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. This is a day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." Verse 26, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. We bless you from the house of the Lord." Verse 29, "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever." So imagine this psalm being sung on the way to Gethsemane, where Jesus is going to suffer in prayer as he faces betrayal, denial by Peter and others, desertion by the disciples, and eventually his crucifixion and death. So you almost see this hope of what's going to be happening through Jesus' death and resurrection. I just want to say a couple more things about communion, and that is a lot of folks as Christians divide themselves over this meal. Some say that it's what we call transubstantiation, that the bread and the wine become literally the body and blood of Christ. Others say it's consubstantiation, that's kind of around, that Jesus' true body and blood are around the blood and are around the wine and the bread. Others say it's simply a symbol. It's just a symbol of the body and blood. And people divide themselves over these. Others say that you should take communion with a common cup and a single loaf, because that's what he does here, right? He takes a single loaf and they pass it around, a common cup, they pass it around. Whereas others have individual servings, or even in little plastic containers with the peel-back lids. What's interesting to me with all this division over this meal is, what was its original function? It was to do this in remembrance of Jesus. That was its point. It was to remember Jesus. not our divisions, not different ways of what it could mean, but simply to remember Jesus. What I find fascinating with this is, like, I come from a tradition where we baptize by immersion. Why? Because that's the way they did it in the New Testament, and also it's where the form, immersion, best fits the function, which is new life, death to resurrection, cleansing. The total immersion of a person symbolizes this cleansing and death to life. Therefore, we do it that way because its form best fits its function of new life, freedom from sin, cleansing, and so forth. At the same time, those same folks don't use a common cup and common loaf because of, obviously, germs and so forth. But yet, in that case, the form, a single loaf, common cup, best fits its function of remembering Jesus in community, of a piece of bread and a body broken, of a cup shared, of Jesus' life shared for us. Whereas those maybe who take it a bit more seriously as far as its form goes, and they do a common cup, are also the ones who maybe sprinkle babies and not immerse people of age of accountability. I'm not bringing this up to be controversial. I'm just saying the fact that we need to have more grace with each other on how we interpret these texts. And what is the main function of baptism? Well, it's to renew, to commit to Christ, to show death to new life. I think God honors that intention, what we're trying to do. The amount of water seems relatively irrelevant to me. And the same thing with communion. We are to remember Jesus. How could you best do that? Do it that way. And I'd say for people that would be very upset over a common cup because of maybe germs and things like that in our culture today, individual serving may be the best way to go in a community. But my point is that the real function of these things is our relationship with Jesus, our relationship with God. Focus on that part and not what divides us, but have grace on each other with how we do these things. Okay, enough on that. I want to talk a little bit now, just briefly, about Gethsemane. So Gethsemane, the word simply means olive press. And in fact, if you go to Capernaum, where Jesus grew up, there was a lot of olive presses in that area. So he's familiar with them. So this is where they would press olives with these huge stones and squeeze all that oil out of the olives. So this idea of Jesus being squeezed until literally blood runs out of him as he suffers. And he suffers by going to a place to pray as he faces his death, to ask his friends to pray with him, to just stay awake. And they don't. In fact, before this, Jesus says that Peter will deny him 3 times. Peter says, no, I'll not deny you. I will never deny you. But yet, 3 times in the story of Gethsemane, Peter and the disciples are caught sleeping. In a way, the greatest violence in Gethsemane isn't really, the cutting off of the servant's ear or Jesus being arrested. I think the greatest violence itself in Gethsemane is the falling asleep, is the disciples who are just too busy, too tired, too distracted to really focus on their friends. I think their friend, in this case Jesus, I think that's where we kind of get caught up. We get so busy with everything else going on in our lives, with everything else happening, that we forget that in this case here, Jesus needed us. He needed us to stay awake, to pay attention, to commit our lives in a real way to what he needed. We always think about what we need from God, but what does God need from us? And a great reminder, I think, of Gethsemane is simply that. Are we paying attention enough to Jesus? Are we really there for what God needs from us? And not just what we need from him, because it's a relationship. In this case, he needed them just to simply stay awake. Maybe God needs us to stay awake too, to pay attention to what he's doing in the world around us and to be involved in it. So we'll continue next time with chapter 27, and we'll see you then before the day ends.